In the shadowed heart of Philadelphia stands a place where time itself seems to falter. Eastern State Penitentiary, a gale that confined not just men, but their very souls. The camera pans down the desolate corridor of Cellblock 7, where flickering shadows dance. These walls hold secrets, whispers in the dark, laughter that chills the blood, and a shadow that knows your name. A gust of wind howls, and the light flickers. Tonight, we unravel the story of Callahan, a man who faced the terrors of this place and never escaped them. Are you ready to step into the darkness? If this tale sends shivers down your spine, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel, British Hauntings, for a weekly dose of spine-chilling stories. And pop down to the comments below to share your thoughts. Would you dare venture into such a place? Or have you ever encountered something truly inexplicable? Let us know. Now brace yourself, because the shadows of Eastern State are stirring. The iron gates of Eastern State Penitentiary loomed like a silent judge, their rusted bars casting jagged shadows across the cracked courtyard. It was 1965, and the Philadelphia sky hung heavy with storm clouds, the air thick with the kind of damp that clung to your bones. Inside, the prison was a decaying beast, its stone walls scarred from a century of despair. Solitary confinement cells, barely bigger than coffins, lined the spokes of the wheel-shaped cell blocks, each one a testament to the penitentiary's brutal philosophy: break the body, reform the soul. Jimmy Callahan, a small-time thief serving his third stint, shuffled down cell block 7, his chains clinking against the concrete. He'd heard the stories, every inmate had, whispers about the shadows that moved without a source, the giggles echoing from empty cells, the cold fingers that grazed your neck when you were alone. Jimmy didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in what he could steal, what he could touch. But tonight, something felt wrong. The air was heavier, the silence sharper, like the prison was holding its breath. He was in solitary, again, from mouthing off to a guard. The cell was a slab of darkness, the only light a sliver of moonlight slicing through a high barred window. Jimmy sat on the cot, his breath visible in the chill, and tried to ignore the stories. Al Capone, they said, had screamed in this very block, swearing a ghost from his Chicago massacre was after him. A guy named Jimmy, no less, gunned down in a garage years ago. Just prison talk, Jimmy told himself, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft as a snake's hiss, curling around his name. Jimmy. His head snapped up, eyes darting to the corners of the cell, nothing but shadows. He laughed it off, nerves, but the sound came again, closer, like it was breathing down his neck. Jimmy. The temperature plummeted, his skin prickling as if invisible hands brushed against his arms. He bolted upright, heart hammering, and pressed himself against the wall, stone cold as a grave. The whispers turned to giggles, high and sharp, like a child's, but wrong, twisted. They bounced off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Jimmy's eyes locked on a shadow in the corner, a shape too tall, too thin, its edges blurring like smoke. It didn't move, but it watched. He could feel it, a weight on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. "Who's there?" he choked out, voice barely a rasp. No answer, just the giggles, now joined by footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing outside his cell. The lock was secure, he'd checked it 100 times, but the sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right at his door. Silence. Then a touch, cold, like a hand fresh from ice water, grazed his cheek. Jimmy screamed, stumbling back, tripping over the cot. The shadow in the corner was gone, but the cell felt alive, the walls pulsing with something he couldn't name. Morning came, gray and sluggish, and the guards found Jimmy curled in the corner, muttering about hands and shadows. They dragged him out, wrote it off as cabin fever. But the other inmates knew better. Eastern State wasn't just a prison. It was a cage for things that didn't die, things that lingered in the cracks of the walls, waiting for someone to listen. Jimmy never spoke of it again, but he never slept alone after that, not even when he got out. The penitentiary, long since since abandoned, still stands in Philadelphia, its empty cells whispering to anyone who dares walk its halls. Some say it's just the wind, others know better. Jimmy Callahan left Eastern State Penitentiary in the spring of '66, a free man on paper, but chained to that night in Cellblock 7. Philadelphia's streets felt too open, too bright. The bustle of Fairmount Avenue, a jarring contrast to the prison's suffocating silence. He rented a one-room apartment above a deli, the kind of place that smelled of pastrami and regret, and took a job sweeping floors at a corner bar. But freedom didn't feel free. Every shadow in the alley, every creak of the floorboards sent his heart racing, his eyes darting for that too tall, too thin figure he'd seen in the cell. Nights were the worst. He'd lie awake, the neon glow from a Schlitz sign outside his window casting jagged patterns on the ceiling, and hear it again, the whisper, "Jimmy." Soft, like a lover's call, but laced with something cruel. He'd bought a radio to drown it out, kept it tuned to WIBG's late-night rock and roll, but even Chuck Berry's guitar couldn't mask the giggles that sometimes slipped through, high and wrong, like a record played backward. He'd check the locks, wedge a chair under the doorknob, but the cold came anyway, a brush of icy fingers on his neck, his arm, his face. Sleep became a battle he rarely won. The bar's regulars noticed Jimmy's twitchy eyes, the way he'd flinch at nothing. "Prison broke you, huh?" they'd tease, tossing peanut shells at his broom. He'd force a grin, mutter something about hard time, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Eastern State had followed him. One night, after last call, he told old man Riley, a grizzled cabbie who drank rye like water, about the cell, the shadow, the hands. Riley didn't laugh. He leaned in, breath sour, and said, "That place don't let go. My uncle worked there in the '40s, said the walls kept things, bad things. You don't lock up that much pain and expect it to stay quiet." Jimmy started digging after that, haunting the library on Vine Street, flipping through yellowed newspaper clippings about the penitentiary. He read about Al Capone's screams, claiming Jimmy was after him, a ghost from the St. Valentine's Day bloodbath. He found stories of inmates driven mad in solitary, scratching at walls until their fingers bled, babbling about voices and eyes in the dark. A 1930s guard's log mentioned unexplained disturbances in Cellblock 7, footsteps, laughter, prisoners begging to be moved. The prison's records, spotty and faded, hinted at deaths uncounted, suicides, beatings, men left to rot in those coffin-sized cells. He went back to Eastern State one gray afternoon, standing outside its towering walls, now crumbling and choked with ivy. The place was closed, a relic waiting to become a museum, but Jimmy bribed a groundskeeper to let him in. The air inside was the same, thick, cold, alive. He walked to Cellblock 7, his boots echoing in the empty corridor, and stood before his old cell. The door was ajar, the lock rusted, useless. He stepped inside, the familiar chill crawling up his spine. "What do you want?" he whispered, voice shaking but defiant. The giggles came first, skittering like roaches across the walls. Then the shadow, taller than before, its edges bleeding into the stone. It didn't move, but Jimmy felt its gaze, heavy as a hand on his throat. "Jimmy!" The whisper hissed, closer now, inside his skull. He stumbled back, heart pounding, and something cold clamped around his wrist, yanking him toward the wall. He screamed, wrenching free, and ran, not stopping until he was outside, gasping in the courtyard, the groundskeeper staring like he'd seen a ghost himself. Jimmy never went back. He moved to Pittsburgh, then Cleveland, chasing distance, but the whispers followed, faint but relentless. By 1970, he was a shadow of himself, jumping at every sound, sleeping with the lights on. One night, in a cheap motel, he wrote a letter to his sister, the only person he still trusted. "It's not just memories," he scrawled. "Eastern State's got a piece of me. If I don't make it, don't go looking there. It's waiting." They found him the next morning, eyes wide, hands clutching his throat. No marks, but the terror on his face. Eastern State sits quiet now, its halls open to tourists and ghost hunters, its walls whispering to those who listen. Locals say Cellblock 7 is colder than the rest, that shadows move when the lights flicker. Some call it history, others call it something else. Jimmy's letter, tucked in a box in his sister's attic, yellows with age, but the penitentiary doesn't forget. It waits, patient as stone, for the next soul to claim. Jimmy Callahan's sister, Maureen, found the letter a month after his death, tucked inside a shoebox with his old prison ID and a half-pack of Chesterfields. The ink was smudged, the words frantic, like he'd written it with a shaking hand. "It's waiting," he'd scrawled, and Maureen, a practical woman who taught 3rd grade in South Philly, felt a chill she couldn't explain. She'd never believed Jimmy's ghost stories, thought they were just the booze or the years behind bars talking. But the letter hit different. It wasn't just fear, it was a warning. She burned it in the kitchen sink, watching the edges curl to ash. But the words stuck, clawing at her thoughts. By 1975, Easton State Penitentiary was a husk, its walls crumbling under decades of neglect. The city talked about turning it into a historic site, but to locals, it was a place to avoid after dark. Maureen, though, couldn't stay away. Jimmy's death, officially a heart attack, but with no history of heart trouble, gnawed at her. She wasn't a ghost hunter, didn't own a Ouija board, but she needed answers. On a damp October evening, she drove to the penitentiary, parking her beat-up Ford Falcon block away. The groundskeeper, the same one Jimmy had bribed years before, was still there, older now, with eyes that didn't quite meet hers. "You sure?" he asked, pocketing her $20. She nodded, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. The air inside was heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. The corridors smelled of mold and something sharper, metallic like old blood. Maureen followed the path to Cellblock 7, her sneakers scuffing against the chipped concrete. The silence was wrong, too thick, broken only by the distant drip of water. She'd brought a photo of Jimmy, a faded Polaroid from before his first stint, all cocky grin and slicked back hair. She held it tight, like it could anchor her to something real. At Jimmy's cell, the door hung open, the hinges rusted to a dull red. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark, catching motes of dust that seemed to swirl with purpose. "Jimmy," she whispered, half expecting an answer, half hoping for none. The temperature dropped, sharp and sudden, her breath clouding in the beam. Then the giggles came, high, jagged, like a child playing a cruel game. They skittered around her, bouncing off the walls, and Maureen froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Jimmy, if you're here, say something," she said, louder now, her voice trembling but firm. The giggles stopped. Silence, heavy as stone, pressed in. Then a whisper, so close it brushed her ear. "Maureen!" Her knees buckled, the flashlight clattering to the floor. She scrambled for it, her hands shaking, and in the flickering beam, she saw it. A shadow, too tall, too thin, standing in the corner. Its edges weren't right, blurring like ink in water, and it watched her, its presence a weight that squeezed her chest. She backed toward the door, the Polaroid slipping from her fingers, but something cold grazed her arm like fingers trailing ice. "Leave her," a new voice hissed, rough and familiar. Jimmy's. The shadow shifted as if startled, and Maureen bolted, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping in the night air, the groundskeeper nowhere in sight. The photo was gone, left behind in the cell, but she swore she heard Jimmy's voice again, faint on the wind. "Don't come back." Maureen never did. She moved to Jersey, took a new teaching job, tried to bury it all, but she stopped sleeping with the lights off, kept a rosary under her pillow. The penitentiary became a museum in the 90s, drawing tourists with its ghost tours and crumbling grandeur. Cellblock 7 stayed the coldest, guides said, and some swore they saw a woman's shadow clutching a photo or heard a man's voice warning, "Don't come back." Maureen, older now, gray creeping into her hair, never told the story, not even to her kids. But she kept a lock on her bedroom door, and when the wind howled at night, she'd lie awake listening for giggles, for whispers, for the brother who never really left Eastern State. The prison still stands, its walls holding tight to their secrets, waiting for the next visitor to step too close. Maureen's kids, Tommy and Ellen, grew up sensing their mother's unease, the way her eyes flicked to the corners of rooms, or how she'd go quiet when anyone mentioned Philly. By 1995, Eastern State Penitentiary had opened its gates to the public, its decaying cell blocks now a draw for curious tourists and thrill-seekers chasing ghost stories. Tommy, a wiry 22-year-old with his Uncle Jimmy's sharp jaw and restless energy, couldn't resist. He'd heard bits of his mom's story, never the full thing, just enough to know Uncle Jimmy's death wasn't as simple as a heart attack. Ellen, his cautious older sister, tried to talk him out of it, but Tommy was stubborn, the kind of guy who'd poke a hornet's nest just to see what happened. "I'm not afraid of some old prison," he told her, tossing a flashlight into his backpack. "I just want to know what got Mom so